Hi students.
Today we would focus on the subject Geography, Chapter 1 Resource and Development. Children, in the lower classes, you have already learnt about the term resources. Okay, what do you mean by resources? Anything which satisfy our needs are called resources. Everything available in our environment which can be used to satisfy our needs provided it is technologically accessible, economically feasible, and culturally acceptable can be termed as a resource. Okay. Children, there is an interdependent relationship between nature, technology, and institutions. This can be illustrated with the help of this diagram. Physical environment, that means nature, then technology, then institutions. So these human beings interact with nature through technology and create institutions to accelerate their economic development. Children, look at this slide. These are different types of natural resources. Do you think that resources are free gifts of nature as is assumed by many? They are not. Resources are a function of human activities. Human beings themselves are essential components of resources. They transform material available in our environment into resources and use them. Then classification of resources. Children, our resources can be classified in these following ways: natural and human resources. These natural resources can be further classified into renewable and non-renewable resources. Then renewable resources can be classified into continuous or flow, then biological. Again, biological resources can be classified into natural vegetation or forest and wildlife. Then non-renewable resources can be further classified into recyclable resources and non-recyclable resources. Human beings can be classified into structures and institutions, then quantity and quality. Let us study all these topics in detail. Natural resources can be classified on the basis of origin into biotic resources and abiotic resources. Biotic resources includes all living things and abiotic resources includes all non-living things. These are obtained from biosphere and have life such as human beings, flora and fauna, fisheries, livestock, etc. Then abiotic means all those things which are composed of non-living things are called abiotic resources. For example, rocks, metals, etc. Okay. So once more, on the basis of origin, resources can be classified into biotic resources and abiotic resources. Biotic resources obtained from biosphere and they have life. For example, human beings, flora and fauna, fisheries, livestock, etc. Then abiotic resources composed of non-living things. For example, rocks and metals. Then next one, on the basis of exhaustibility. Resources can be classified into renewable resources and non-renewable resources. Renewable resources are renewable or replenishable resources which can be renewed or reproduced by physical, chemical, or mechanical processes. For example, solar and wind energy, water, forest resources, and wildlife, etc. Renewable resources may further be divided into continuous or flow resources such as wind and water. Then what about the non-renewable resources? They are formed over substantially long geological time. For example, minerals and fossil fuels. These can be subdivided into recyclable resources, example metals, non-recyclable resources, for example fossil fuels, which cannot be recycled and get exhausted with their use. Then next important classification is on the basis of ownership. Individual resources, community-owned resources, national resources, and international resources. So on the basis of ownership, resources can be classified into four, which are the individual resources, community-owned resources, national resources, and international resources. First one, individual resources. What do you mean by individual resources? Individual resources are resources that are owned privately by individuals. For example, land owned by farmers, allotted by the government against the payment of revenue, plantations, pasture lands, ponds, water in wells owned by individuals, then plots, houses, and other property owned by people in the city, etc. So the resources that are owned by privately by individuals. Okay. Owned privately by individuals are known as individual resources. Then second one, community resources. Community resources are resources accessible to all the members of the community. Okay. These are accessible to all the members of the community. For example, village commons such as grazing grounds, burial grounds, village ponds, etc. Then public parks, picnic spots, playgrounds in urban areas. All these are the examples of community-owned resources. Then next one, national resources. Okay, national resources. National resources are all the resources that belong to a nation. For example, roads, canals, railways, etc. Then minerals, water resources, forests, wildlife, etc. Land within the political boundaries. Then the territorial water and the resources within the term territorial water refers to the oceanic area up to 12 nautical miles. Very important. The term territorial water refers to the oceanic area up to 12 nautical miles. That means 19.2 kilometers from the coast. The country has legal powers to acquire even private property for public good. Urban development authorities get empowered by the government to acquire land. So, these are the examples of national resources. That means the resources which belongs to a nation. Then next one, international resources. Very important, international resources. And international resources are regulated by certain international institutions. These international resources include the oceanic resources beyond 200 kilometers of the exclusive economic zone, which belong to open ocean, and no individual country can utilize these without the concurrence of international institutions. India had to obtain the right to mine manganese nodules from the bed of the Indian Ocean from an area which lies beyond the exclusive economic zone. On the basis of the status of development, resources can be classified into potential resources, developed resources, stock, and reserve. First one, potential resources. What do you mean by potential resources? The resources are found in a region which have not been utilized. For example, wind and solar energy development potential in the states of Gujarat and Rajasthan. Then next one, developed resources. What do you mean by that? Developed resources? The resources that have been surveyed and determined for utilization, both qualitatively and quantitatively. The development of resources depends upon the technological and level of their feasibility. Okay, potential resources are resources found in a region which have not been utilized. But developed resources are resources that have been surveyed and determined for utilization both qualitatively and quantitatively. But what happened? The development of these resources depends upon the technological and level of their feasibility. Okay. Then next one, stock. What do you mean by stock? Stock refers to a material in the environment which have the potential to satisfy human needs, but human beings do not have the appropriate technology to access these. For example, water is a compound of two inflammable gases, that means hydrogen and oxygen, which could be used as a rich source of energy if we had the required technical know-how. Hence, it can be considered as the stock. Then what about reserves? Reserves are the subset of the stock, which are yet to be put in use with the help of existing technical know-how. These can be used for meeting future requirements. Underline this. This can be used for meeting future requirements. Example, river water can be used for generating hydroelectric power, but presently it is being utilized only to a limited extent. Thus, the water in the dams is a reserve which can be used in the future. Okay. So, these are the examples. You have to study all these examples. Reserve, example, the water in the dams. Then stock, example, water is a compound of two inflammable gases. These are the two examples. Okay. Then, what do you mean by the development of resources? It is the process of developing the resources in order to make them useful for satisfying human wants. Some resources cannot be used directly. They have to be processed to make them useful for satisfying our wants. Example, land has to be cleared and plowed for growing crops. Water has to be taken in the field to irrigate. Then what are the different types of problems created by the indiscriminate exploitation of resources? First one, many resources got depleted. For example, forest. Because of the overuse, many resources got depleted. Then resources got accumulated in the hands of few people. So the society is divided into rich and poor. There is a wide gap between the haves and have-nots. Okay. Then third one, global warming, ozone layer depletion, environmental degradation are the other problems faced or created by the indiscriminate exploitation of resources. This is very important question. Then what is sustainable economic development? Another important one. What do you mean by sustainable economic development? Sustainable economic development means the economic development which does not damage the environment and at the same time takes care of the needs of the future generations. Okay, this is very important. You must study the definition of sustainable development from your textbook. The economic development which should not damage the environment and at the same time takes care of the needs of the future generations is called sustainable development. Why sustainable development is important? Many of the resources are non-renewable and exhaustible. So, overexploitation of these resources will affect the needs of our future generation. Then the second point is the environmental pollution has become a major threat to the survival of human beings. Children, have you heard about Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992? Look at this slide. United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. In June 1992, more than 100 heads of the state met in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil for the first International Earth Summit. The summit was convened for addressing urgent problems of environmental protection and socio-economic development at the global level. The assembled leaders signed the Declaration on Global Climatic Change and Biological Diversity. The Rio Convention endorsed the Global Forest Principles and adopted the Agenda 21 for achieving sustainable development in the 21st century. Agenda 21. Okay, it is a declaration signed by world leaders in 1992 at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which took place at Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It aims at achieving global sustainable development. This is the main aim of this Agenda 21, achieving global sustainable development. It is an agenda to combat environmental damage, poverty, disease through global cooperation on common interest, mutual needs, and shared responsibilities. One of the major objectives of this Agenda 21 is that every local government should draw its own local Agenda 21. What is resource planning? Resource planning is a technique or skill of proper utilization of resources. Resource planning is a technique or skill of proper utilization of resources. There are three stages of resource planning. There are three stages or steps of resource planning. Which are they? First one, identification and listing of resources. Then second one, planning for exploitation. Then third one, match resource development plans with national development plans. So the first one, identification and listing of resources. It includes surveying, mapping, and the measurement of the qualities and the quantities of the resources are the important activities undertaken at this first stage. Okay, what is the first stage? Identification and listing of resources. Then the second one, planning for exploitation. Develop a planning structure with suitable technology and skill, institutional setup, etc. Okay. Develop a planning structure with suitable technology, skill, and institutional setup. Then third one, match resource development plans with the national development plans. Then the importance of resource planning. Is it necessary to maintain the balanced development programs in India? Why? Some regions of India are rich in certain resources and poor in some other resources. Okay, first one, some regions of India are rich in certain types of resources and poor in some other resources. That means there are regions which are rich in certain types of resources but are deficient in some other resources. Okay, so for example, Rajasthan is poor in water resources but rich in solar and wind energy. Then the states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, etc. are rich in minerals and coal deposits. Then Arunachal Pradesh has abundance of water resources but lacks in infrastructural development. Then the cold desert of Ladakh is relatively isolated from the rest of the country and it has very rich cultural heritage, but it is deficient in water infrastructure and some vital minerals. Okay, so this calls for a balanced resource planning at the national, state, regional and local levels. Then the wastage of resources can be avoided by planning. So this resource planning is very important. Then environmental pollution can be reduced. Then over exploitation of resources can be avoided through the resource planning. Children, what do you mean by resource conservation? Planned use of resources in order to meet the present needs and to store a part for the future generations is called resource conservation. Then, is it necessary to conserve resources? Why? Yes, it is necessary to conserve resources. Many resources are non-renewable and exhaustible. If we conserve them, we can use them for a longer period of time. Okay, because all these resources are non-renewable and exhaustible. So, we have to conserve them for future use. Then conservation of resources help us to reduce wastage. It will help in economic progress. Then resource conservation helps us to protect the environment. It also helps us to protect environment. Then Gandhiji is concerned about resource conservation. According to Gandhiji, there is enough for everybody's need and not for anybody's greed. Okay, this is the famous quote. According to Gandhiji, there is enough for everybody's need and not for anybody's greed. Greedy and selfish individuals and the exploitative nature of modern technology are the root cause for the resource depletion. He was against mass production and wanted to replace it with the production by masses. Okay. So children, let us conclude today's topic by recollecting all the concepts. What do you mean by resources? Everything available in our environment which can be used to satisfy our needs provided it is technologically accessible, economically feasible and culturally acceptable can be termed as a resource. Then classification of resources, natural resources, then natural resources on the basis of origin classified into biotic and abiotic resources. Then on the basis of exhaustibility, renewable and non-renewable resources. Then on the basis of ownership, individual resources, community-owned resources, national resources, international resources. Then next one, on the basis of the status of development, potential resources, developed resources, stock and reserve. Okay. Then sustainable development. What do you mean by sustainable development? The economic development which does not damage the environment and at the same time takes care of the needs of the future generations is called sustainable development. Then Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, Agenda 21. Then resource planning, the three stages of resource planning. Then the importance of resource planning, resource conservation and Gandhiji's concern about our resource conservation. So children, please note that the corresponding URL, notes of the lesson and test paper are also attached along with this video. Make use of all these available resources, study well and attend the test paper without fail. Thank you.